A young nun arrives in Rome to take her final vows. At an orphanage run by the church, she becomes embroiled in a conspiracy to birth the Antichrist. Looking at Margaret, you can immediately anticipate some of the visual and psychological motifs that are going to come into play here. There's an entire subgenre of nunsploitation films fueled by the tension and contrast between the nun's dark conservative uniformity and the carnal, often hysterical woman hidden underneath. These are the kinds of tropes and cinematic language which I think the First Omen is most successful playing with. One of the best moments in the film is when Margaret goes to the discotheque with her roommate, a fellow nun, for a kind of rumspringa before they take their vows. I like these moments because they show conflict. They show a kind of push and pull between the secular and the religious life that mirrors the protests going on throughout the film. These are also the moments that make you forget you're watching an entry in a franchise, that do the most to make the film feel like it stands apart. It's as the film begins to cleave towards the mythology established by previous entries, that's where I think it starts to lose its way. The film loses its way as it abandons ambiguity and uncertainty, and as its artful visual style starts to lean a little too heavily on homage. The reliance on homage becomes especially distracting because there is so much else in the film that seems so aesthetically mature, that is a cut above so many other modern horror movies that attempt a similar art house influenced style. We get the scaffolding mishap in the beginning, which calls to mind one of the deaths from the 1976 original. Okay, fine. The shot where the metal pole collides with a piece of stained glass depicting a young woman is a clever bit of symbolism that helps set the stage for the entire thesis of the film. Later, we get a slight twist on the nanny's death from the original, which, while I can appreciate the way in which it's executed, it does start to make the film feel a bit encumbered by it being part of a franchise. The moment feels a little too much like obligation. I think the worst offender, though, is an homage not to any film in the Omen series, but to another horror film, to 1981's Possession. I did not like this scene in the First Omen. I think it's really tacky, I think it's too on the nose, and so of course it's everyone's favorite on Twitter. Anytime anyone talks about Possession, it almost exclusively revolves around this one scene, and why shouldn't it? It's crazy bananas. But then, because the scene has become so iconic, is so talked about, it makes this homage to it stick out like a sore thumb. It makes this moment in the First Omen less an homage to another film and more an homage to a Twitter gif. This is the cinematic equivalent of a retweet. The other way the First Omen falters is by abandoning any sense of subtlety or ambiguity in its themes. For starters, the conflict between religion and secularism is eventually resolved in hardline atheism, made apparent in a scene where Bill Nye says something to the effect of, "You're doing God's work, don't you hear his voice?" To which Margaret says, "No, I only hear my own." Even before watching the film, I thought to myself, what is really the point of a religious horror movie anymore? What's the point of a religious horror movie in a mostly secular society? It's not particularly subversive anymore, is it? How does a secular atheist entertainment industry even approach religious horror? The answer is, of course, that they approach it in secular atheistic fashion, as first an aesthetic and then as a political exercise. Catholicism as religion might have fallen out of favor, but Catholicism as a collection of symbols and aesthetics, Catholicism as cultural and cinematic iconography, that can still be of some use. Catholicism as a political inflection point, that too can still be of some use. As a side note, this is kind of the same way Hollywood treats H.P. Lovecraft, where they want to make use of all the cool tentacle monsters and cyclopean geometries without all the baggage of the xenophobic paranoia, which, for better or worse, is so integral to Lovecraft's particular brand of storytelling. At the time of its release, The First Omen drew many comparisons to Immaculate, a film with a similar story, setting, and themes released at about the same time, to which Bilge Ebiri of Vulture wrote, "Why should anyone be surprised that suddenly, in the wake of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, as state after state attempts to enact religious laws depriving women of bodily agency, America is getting horror movies about people forced into monstrous births by religious institutions worried about their growing irrelevance. In The First Omen, religion is less an avenue to examine belief and more a lens lens by which to establish a political thesis about abortion and bodily autonomy. In doing so, however, it creates a kind of logic problem where the film appeals to a more secular notion of bodily autonomy in the face of religious imposition, while at the same time treating that religion as true and real and of immediate material consequence to its central protagonist. In theory, this could create an interesting conundrum for someone like Margaret. What is the reaction of someone whose deeply held beliefs forbid abortion when confronted by an objective evil growing inside their womb? The film never really dwells on that though, and instead we get a very immediate, very secular, get this thing out of me. Feminine body horror has always been a staple of the genre. From The Fly to Rosemary's Baby, there are many films that deal with women's fears surrounding rape, pregnancy, and childbirth. The problem with The First Omen isn't in its tackling of those themes, but the way it squanders the unique perspective its main character might have offered them, failing to follow through on its central premise of the secular being in conflict with the religious. It's interesting how God, or any contest between God and the devil, is mostly absent from The First Omen. If the devil and the Antichrist are real, we can reasonably assume God and a Christ are too, right? Where in the original film, Gregory Peck was instructed to kill Damien on holy ground, to stab him with the daggers of Megiddo, here there's none of that mumbo-jumbo. Why would there be in a film that ultimately leads towards a secular atheist point of view, aimed at a largely secular audience? It's interesting how wherever we might find any traditional symbolic counterpoint to Satan, it's bestowed a negative connotation, is made to conform to a more modern secular opinion concerning religion. Where in the original film it was Satanists trying to birth the Antichrist, here it's been reworked into being the church itself, trying to stave off the rise of secularism. In one scene, a wimple is given all the visual coding of a corset. In another, rows of candles at an altar are made to look like a pair of jaws. Where in the original film, the jackal was the Antichrist's mother, here it's the father. In this film, Damien has a twin sister, assumably the good one of the two. The religious symbology of God good, devil bad is transfigured into the modern activist symbology of secular feminist materialism good, Western patriarchal religion bad. The film starts off as presenting a conflict between secular and religious values, inviting a nuanced examination of the two, only to wind up a polemic for the one and a struggle session for the other. Sure, the film provides its caveats, where Father Brennan makes a point to distinguish the bad, no good part of the church from the real and true one he and Margaret believe in, but it rings hollow when the supposed real and true church is mostly absent or ineffectual. All in all, the film resolves in by now routine platitudes and affirmations that might have been much more forgivable had the film maintained its more artfully crafted visual style and leaned less heavily on soy-faced Twitter pastiche.